The next steps for advancing animal law and protection, in my view, is to really kind of take into account the recent Harvard study about what it takes for nonviolent social movements to win majority favor and actually have the causes they're pursuing become reality. And this was a study that basically said it really just takes 3.5% of the population kind of becoming visible and protesting about something and asking for something that governments start to respond, and eventually what they're asking for comes to effect. So I really think that our efforts have to be mobilized, and we're very much encouraged by this type of figure. 3.5% doesn't seem so much, and if we can really consolidate our efforts and mobilize the public to show that type of kind of demand for certain outcomes, that the empirical evidence tells us over decades and across the world that the demand will eventually be heard and met. So I think that would be kind of the next step for the animal law protection movement, is to consolidate efforts to get at this 3.5% for every type of regulatory change that's desired.
In my opinion, the next steps for advancement in animal law is to really try to do whatever is necessary to move animal law from the margins into the center or the mainstream. So I find in my work, often with law students, they'll ask me, what is animal law? They won't know what it is. So I really think we kind of need to do whatever we can to make that not a question that anybody asks anymore. So through courses and research projects, collaborative ones, and student groups, giving support to them, those are all great mechanisms for doing that.
The next steps for advancing animal law and protection, I think, involve first training the next generation of animal lawyers and policymakers, then plugging those animal lawyers and policymakers into an infrastructure where they can achieve real change. And I think particularly doing that beyond just the United States, expanding to a global focus. So we have animal lawyers working with policymakers globally.
I think one of the most important next steps in advancing the animal protection movement is banning the worst practices. So that either means through legislation or corporate policy. And I come at it from a farm animal protection perspective. So that means getting rid of all cages and crates globally. And that's a big effort, and it's a really actually a short-term piece of work, but it's an important one for the next steps in advancing the animal protection movement.
So there is no silver bullet when it comes to advancing the interest of animals in the law. And this observation has actually led us to think that we should maybe work on a different range of measures. So for instance, when it comes to the specific context of animal agriculture, this would mean, of course, improving standards in animal welfare legislation, but also, for instance, reducing subsidies going to animal agriculture, raising taxes on animal source products, or impose more environmental standards or labor regulations in slaughterhouses, on farms, etc.
The next steps for the animal protection movement are to continue to build a broad, popular, justice-based movement for non-human animals. I think we need to do a better job of not only highlighting how animals suffer exploitation, but also the positive aspects of what it means to be an animal, the ways in which animals experience not only the suffering that we rightly draw attention to, but also their capacity for pleasure and joy. And so I think the movement needs to do a lot more around building opportunities to not only talk about animal suffering, but also build up the idea of animals' capacity to flourish, to give positive inspiration to people to make changes that are consistent with a lot of the values that they already hold.
The next steps for advancement in animal law and protection, I think, have to be, one, more emphasis on animal rights rather than just animal welfare. So we have to find different ways to enact different theories of animal rights in the courtroom and in legislation and policy. I also think that it's very important that we empower animal attorneys and policymakers with science, because science is something that empowers anyone who's using it. and it's often used in the service of abusing and exploiting animals, but can also be used to empower people who are advocating for animals. And I think that's extremely important as well.
Science gives us evidence of the sentience of animals. It gives us evidence of the suffering of animals. It gives us evidence of the environmental destruction caused by exploitation of animals. And it gives us evidence of the injuries to consumers and slaughterhouse workers. Science also provides us with alternatives to using animals. It gives us alternatives for using animals as food, and it provides alternatives for using animals as research models. I think that science provides us with information and also a way out of animal exploitation.
So I think one of the biggest challenges animal law has faced for a long time now is gaining traction as a more broad-based movement. And so I think the most important step forward is to align animal protection efforts with human health. And there's an unusual but valid opportunity right now with the pandemic and the awareness of the connection between our relationship with animals and preventing the next pandemic and the cause of the current pandemic. So I think that's certainly a way to move the animal law movement forward in a way that will help gain legitimacy and support across many disciplines and not really be more isolated and trapped into a movement driven by compassion and morals. So I think that's something where the environmental protection movement gained a lot of traction when it initially connected our pollution of the environment to our health and safety as humans. And so I think that's where the animal protection movement is now, and hopefully that effort will seize the moment. And the Convention on Animal Protection draft treaty is one important step in that direction.
For me, one of the challenges that the field is facing are conflicts. So things like various environmental regulations that are designed to protect animals can sometimes have perverse effects on animals in the long run. So for instance, take something like the Endangered Species Act, which is designed to protect habitats and animals, species within those habitats. So there are some things that we can do that would improve climate change, but that ironically in the short run might actually harm animals' interests. So take something like the solar power or hydropower, kind of non-fossil power sources, windmills, wind power. Those are incredibly land intensive. So they're necessary to reduce the amount of fossil fuel, kind of emissions that are emitted into the atmosphere that cause greenhouse gases and make climate change worse. But by implementing them, we're having to use lots of land that are currently, kind of occupied by animals, used and needed by animals. So, how do we kind of decide what to do? Do we do things that might harm animals and their livelihood now with the hope that doing them will actually make things better for animals in the long run? Or do we say, we can't make that trade-off right now. We can't destroy these particular habitats in the hope that, this stuff, helps solve the problem of climate change long run. Or if we decide to do that, how can we do that in a way that minimizes harm to animals? So anyway, that's kind of big picture conflicts that I think are coming up, and how we're going to handle them. I don't know. It's hard. I mean, it's one of the reasons that you need, kind of scholars and smart people and activists who are kind of thinking about these and trying to figure out how to make those trade-offs.
So when we're talking about where should animal law go from here, my personal view is that we need to think very carefully about what law can do now. I think people who believe in animal rights, the best thing they can do with their skills is really go out there and disabuse everybody else of their belief and assumption that law helps animals. For example, whenever these stories get to the news, it's very rare for institutional suffering to get to the news, but when we hear these isolated cases of violence against individual animals, my phone rings off the hook this must be illegal, Leslie. How do we make this illegal? Everybody assumes the law protects animals. And as people who have expertise in the law and how it affects animals or interacts with animals, I think the best thing we can do with our skills is just explain that the law does not protect animals. It protects the people who hurt animals. I think it's too soon in the development of our ideology to start looking for legal solutions to most of our problems, some of them. So if it comes down to having to choose one thing for people with expertise in law to do for animals, my vote would be to use all of that skill and expertise to communicate with the society around us, help everybody understand why laws that are in place do not protect animals and really protect the people who want to hurt them.
So I think advancing animal rights law and protection is going to be, there's no magic bullet. There's no single step. There's not an obvious hurdle that we have to overcome. I think it's going to be a combination of public awareness, acceptability. It's going to be about legislatures and governments wanting to do things. I think it's going to be about the adaptability of industry. And I think all of these have to be taken together. We can't simply hope that something good will happen or that there's a magic bullet. I don't think there is. I think there's just going to be a lot of steady work needed. The animal rights movement, I suppose, has been steadily progressing the last 30, 40 years. And I think there's a number of positive signs. So things like veganism, vegan menus and meals. A few years ago, that was wildly unusual. Even vegetarian was unusual. So that sort of thing I think is quite positive. Obviously, there's related movements like climate change. And climate change is about humans thinking about something other than themselves. It's about doing things because, well, not because we can, but because we should. So that changes our perception and our status. And that, again, is something that needs to progress.